The wind tugged at her dress as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her hands holding tightly to the letter that had brought her here. Grace's heart beat hard in her chest, not from fear, but from hope. She had come to this small town to meet the man who had asked for a wife, a mother for his child, and a new beginning. But the eyes that met hers held no welcome. Only sadness. Grace Bennett had never seen a town so quiet. The streets were mostly empty, except for a dog sleeping under a wagon and an old man sweeping dust from his porch. The stagecoach door creaked open behind her, but she didn't turn back. She had made her choice. In one hand, she held a small bag with all her clothes. In the other, a worn letter. The paper was soft at the edges, the ink faded from how many times she had read it. It had come months ago, with words full of kindness and need. A sheriff had written, asking for a wife to help raise his little girl. He said he wanted a quiet woman, someone strong in faith, someone who could bring light back into his home. Grace had answered with her own letter, and when no reply came, she took it as a sign. A sign from God that she should go anyway. She had nothing left where she came from. Only memories that hurt too much and a church that had closed its doors for good. So she came here, hoping to find a place to belong. But the man who met her outside the sheriff's office was not the man she expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a badge pinned to his chest and a shadow in his eyes. His hat shaded most of his face, but Grace could still see the tight line of his mouth, the way his jaw was clenched like he was trying not to speak. "Your Grace?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. There was a long silence. The wind picked up a few dry leaves and rolled them across the ground between them. "I didn't send for you," he said. "My sister did. I didn't know until this morning." The words hit her like a small stone to the heart. Not a sharp blow, just a deep ache. "Oh," she said. Another silence. This one longer. "My sister meant well," he added. "She thinks I need help. Maybe I do. But I didn't ask for a wife." Grace looked down at the letter again, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket. "I understand." She wanted to turn around. She wanted to walk right back to the stagecoach and leave this town behind. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his voice sounded, tired like a man who hadn't slept well in months. Maybe it was the way he didn't look angry, just broken. "I promised to stay a week," she said. That's what the letter said. Just 1 week, to see if it would work. He gave a short nod, like he was too tired to argue. 1 week, then. And that was how she came to the home of Sheriff Eli Walker. The house sat at the edge of town, quiet and gray, with weeds growing along the fence and a porch swing that didn't move. It looked like no one had sat in it for a long time. The front door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The curtains were closed, letting only slivers of light into the rooms. Grace saw a coat hanging by the door that clearly hadn't been worn in a while, and a child's boot lying on its side by the stairs. "Your daughter?" she asked. "Lily," he said. "She's 5. Where is she now?" "At my sister's. I thought, if things didn't go well, she wouldn't have to meet you." Grace nodded. She didn't blame him. A little girl's heart was no place for more confusion or sadness. He showed her to the guest room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a single window looking out over the dry fields. "I'll take care of myself," she said gently. "I can cook and clean while I'm here. I won't be a burden." He looked at her then, really looked. For a moment, something softened in his face. Not much, but enough. "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "Just unexpected." That night, Grace sat on the edge of the bed with her Bible open in her lap. She read quietly, her lips moving with the words, even though she already knew them by heart. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." She looked around the quiet room, then out the window toward the sheriff's home. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she believed, deep in her bones, that she had been sent here for a reason. And so the first day ended. A woman with no one came to a man who had lost everything. She brought only kindness, hope, and her quiet faith. And though the sheriff did not know it yet, the moment Grace stepped off that stagecoach, something had already begun to change. The morning after Grace arrived, the house still felt the weight of silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a thick blanket, making everything seem far away and heavy. Grace woke early, the sun barely peeking over the hills, and her first thought was not of the bed she had slept in, but of the man downstairs, the Sheriff Eli Walker. She had heard the way he sighed the night before when he went to his room, the sound of his boots dragging across the floor, as if he was carrying something far too heavy. She stood up and pulled on the simple dress she had packed, a soft, faded blue. It was the best she had, but it didn't matter much in a house like this. The walls of the house were a dull gray, and the windows were covered with thick curtains, shutting out the light. Everything inside looked old and forgotten. The kind of house where time seemed to stand still, and the only sound was the creaking of the floorboards. Grace brushed her hair quickly, tying it back into a neat bun. She wasn't here to be fancy. She was here to help, to bring warmth and light into a place that felt so far removed from those things. She stepped into the hallway, listening for any sound that might tell her where Eli had gone. The house was too quiet. She moved slowly, not wanting to disturb the stillness. The smell of stale air mixed with the faint scent of coffee as she passed by the kitchen. She could hear him now in the living room, his boots scraping across the floor again. She hesitated at the doorframe. There he was, sitting at the large, old wooden table in the middle of the room. His face was set in a tight, unreadable expression, his hat still low over his eyes, and he was staring down at the empty chair across from him. There was a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of him, but it was cold, untouched. The room seemed to mirror the man, frozen, still, waiting for something to happen that didn't seem to be coming. Grace took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice quiet, like a prayer. Eli didn't look up immediately. He took another slow sip from his cup, his eyes still fixed on the table. He hadn't expected her to be awake so early. The words from the night before lingered in the air, and now they felt too heavy to speak. "I'll make breakfast," Grace offered gently, though she wasn't sure what he would want. She had nothing to go on, no idea if he even cared what she made. But it was something she could do, something she could give. At last, Eli's eyes lifted, and his gaze met hers. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them, and she felt the weight of it pressing in on her. His eyes were tired, but not just from lack of sleep. There was a deep sorrow in them, something old and raw that he kept locked away, hidden behind that hard, silent look. "Do you need anything?" she asked. Her voice was soft, yet it carried a quiet strength. She could see the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, something like regret. He looked away quickly, but not before she caught it. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I'm fine." But his tone didn't match the way he sat, slumped in his chair, his shoulders heavy with some burden. She could tell by the way he held himself that he was anything but fine. Grace moved to the stove without waiting for him to say anything else. She began to cook, the familiar motions of making a simple breakfast soothing her. She cracked eggs into the pan, the soft sizzle filling the air, and the smell of warm food slowly began to chase the cold out of the room. For a while, Eli didn't speak, and neither did Grace. She had come to understand something about people who were hurting. They didn't always need to be fixed. Sometimes, all they needed was someone to be there, quietly. As she worked, Grace stole glances at Eli. He hadn't moved, except for the occasional sip of his coffee. His hands were resting on the table now, but they weren't steady. They shook slightly, just enough for Grace to notice. After a long silence, Eli finally spoke. His voice was quieter than before, almost as if he didn't want to say the words. "Lily's not here," he said, his gaze fixed on the empty chair across from him. His voice cracked just slightly. It wasn't much, but Grace noticed. "She's with my sister for a while. I didn't think she should see me like this." Grace didn't speak at first. There was nothing she could say to fix the hurt in his voice. But she did the only thing she could think of. She poured a little more coffee into his cup and set it down in front of him. "It's hard, isn't it?" she said softly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "When you lose someone." Eli didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, his fingers curling slightly around the edge of the cup. He stared at it as though it might give him the answers he was searching for. "Everything's different now," he muttered. "I don't know how to fix things. I don't know how to be a father to Lily and not feel like I'm betraying her mother." The way he said it, so broken, so raw, touched something deep inside Grace. She knew this pain. She had seen it before in people's eyes, in the way they moved through the world as if they were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "You're not betraying anyone," she said quietly. "You're just trying to live, to be there for her. That's enough." Eli looked up at her then, his eyes searching her face, as if he were looking for something he couldn't quite name. "You don't know me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what it's like." Grace smiled gently, her eyes soft with understanding. "No, I don't. But I know what it's like to feel lost. And sometimes, being lost is just the beginning of finding a new way forward." There was another long silence, but this one felt different. It wasn't heavy like before. It was like a small bridge had formed between them, one built on simple words, on shared understanding. Eli looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she arrived. His gaze softened just slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words simple but sincere. Grace didn't reply. Instead, she set the food down in front of him, her actions speaking louder than any words could. She wasn't there to fix him. She was just there to be kind. To offer him something simple, a meal, a moment of peace. The house was still filled with shadows, but Grace knew that one small light had begun to shine. And sometimes that's all it took. The days passed slowly, like a quiet river winding its way through the valley. Grace had learned that in a house as heavy with sorrow as the sheriff's, it wasn't the loud moments that changed things. It was the soft ones. The quiet gestures, the little things that showed care, that let someone know they weren't alone. She didn't push Eli to talk. She didn't demand that he open up. Instead, she did what she had promised herself she would do. She took care of his home and his little girl, hoping that over time, the walls around his heart would begin to crack. Eli, for his part, had remained distant. He wasn't unkind, but he was distant, like a man who had been burned by the world and wasn't sure he was ready to trust again. He still didn't speak much about his late wife. He didn't ask about Grace's past, though she could tell he was curious. The questions were there in the way he looked at her sometimes, the quiet gaze that seemed to search her face, as if trying to read some story written in her eyes. But Grace didn't mind. She didn't need to share everything. She had come here to help, to bring warmth, not to burden him with her own pain. She let him take his time, just like she had promised. It was on the 4th day after her arrival that things started to shift. The morning had begun like any other. Grace had woken early, as always, and started preparing breakfast. The scent of frying bacon and fresh biscuits filled the house, and she could hear Eli's footsteps in the hall as he made his way downstairs. He didn't say anything, but she could feel his presence behind her as she worked. She didn't turn around, knowing that some things were best left unspoken for now. Lily was at the table, drawing pictures with a small box of colored pencils. She had taken to sitting with Grace every morning, her bright, curious eyes watching as Grace worked. The girl had been quiet ever since her mother had passed, but there were small moments of joy that broke through the sadness, like when she'd laugh at one of Grace's silly stories, or when she'd offer to help set the table, though her tiny hands weren't strong enough to carry much. "Are you going to make pancakes today, Miss Grace?" Lily asked, her voice light and hopeful. "I think so," Grace replied with a smile. "I'll make them extra fluffy just for you." Lily giggled, her eyes lighting up as she imagined the pancakes she loved so much. Eli, who had sat down at the table across from them, didn't join in the conversation. He sat quietly, drinking his coffee, staring at the table as if his thoughts were far away. As Grace worked, she noticed the way Eli's hands gripped his cup tightly, his fingers pale and tense. It was a small thing, but it was enough to make her worry. She had seen that same tightness in his hands before, after a long, hard day on the job, when he would return home with his face drawn tight, like he was holding something in. She had seen that before in people who tried to keep everything inside, afraid to let anything out. "You okay?" she asked, turning to face him for the first time that morning. Eli didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her, then at Lily, who was humming softly as she worked on her drawing. His face was unreadable for a moment, then he sighed, a deep, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of months, maybe years of grief. "I'm fine," he said, though Grace could tell by the way his shoulders tensed that he wasn't. Just then there was a loud thud from outside, the kind of sound that made the house shake a little. Grace's heart skipped a beat, and she rushed to the window, peering through the old, cracked glass. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it. The barn. Smoke was rising from the roof, curling into the sky like a dark cloud. She could see the flickering glow of flames inside, and for a moment, her mind went blank with panic. "Eli," she shouted, turning to him. "The barn. It's on fire." Eli didn't waste a second. He jumped to his feet, his chair scraping across the floor with a sharp noise. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding for the first time since Grace had arrived. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and ran for the door without another word. Grace's heart raced in her chest as she watched him disappear outside. But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the long, heavy shawl from the hook by the door and followed him outside. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat from the flames was already searing her skin. Eli was already at the barn, his face grim and his eyes scanning the scene. The fire was spreading quickly, and the animals inside, horses, goats, chickens, were trapped. Panic rose in Grace's chest, but she forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think. They couldn't save everything, but they could save some. "Eli," she shouted, pushing her way through the thick smoke toward him. "We need to get them out, now." Eli didn't look at her. His focus was solely on the barn, his jaw clenched tight. "Get back to the house," he yelled. "It's too dangerous." But Grace didn't listen. She had seen enough to know that if she waited, it might be too late. She moved toward the barn, her hands covering her mouth to keep from inhaling too much smoke. She could hear the panicked cries of the animals inside, and her heart broke for them. She spotted the horses first, strong, proud creatures, their eyes wide with terror. Grace's heart ached as she moved toward them, but the flames were growing too fast. She couldn't wait any longer. "Eli," she shouted again. "We have to help them. We can't leave them." She reached the barn door and pulled it open, the smoke rushing out in thick, choking waves. The horses were pushing against the door, but they couldn't get out. Grace grabbed the first horse she saw by the reins, her heart racing in her chest. "Come on," she whispered to the horse, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "We're going to get you out of here." She led the horse away from the barn, her mind only on getting it to safety. Behind her, Eli was still shouting, but she couldn't hear his words over the roar of the fire. The smoke made it hard to see, but she kept going, leading the horse away from the flames. Just as she reached the far side of the barn, there was a loud crack. The roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Grace stumbled back, falling to her knees in the dirt. She could feel the heat on her face, but she didn't dare look back. "Grace!" Eli's voice was urgent now, his arms reaching for her as he came running toward her through the smoke. "Get away from there." She barely had time to react before Eli pulled her up, his grip strong around her arm. Together, they stumbled back, out of the reach of the fire. Grace was breathing hard, her chest burning from the smoke, but she didn't feel the pain. She felt only the relief of getting the horse to safety. When they finally reached the yard, Grace turned to Eli. His face was covered in soot, his eyes wild, but there was something different in his gaze now. It wasn't just fear, it was something else. Something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. I couldn't do it alone." Grace didn't say anything at first. She was too busy catching her breath, too busy trying to steady her racing heart. But then she nodded, her hand resting on Eli's arm. "We're all right," she said softly, her voice steady even as her heart continued to race. But Eli's gaze didn't leave hers. There was something raw in his eyes now, a flicker of emotion that he hadn't let her see before. She could tell he was fighting it, trying to keep his walls up, but they were beginning to crack. And for the first time since she had arrived, Grace felt the faintest spark of hope. The days after the fire seemed to pass in a blur, each one blending into the next like the pages of an old book worn by time. The barn had been lost to the flames, but Grace had stayed by Eli's side, helping him rebuild what had been destroyed. And though the work was hard and the days long, the house, once a place of sorrow, began to feel different. The air was lighter, as if the weight of grief had been lifted just a little. For the first time since she had arrived, Grace felt like she was a part of something. A part of Eli's world. A part of his healing. The mornings had become easier, less quiet. Lily, though still shy, had begun to talk to Grace more. She asked about the stars at night, about the stories Grace used to tell, and about the world outside their small town. Grace had shared everything she could, though some stories were too painful to tell. The past had shaped her, but she didn't want it to define her, not anymore. And then there was Eli. He was still a man of few words, but the way he looked at her had changed. He would catch her gaze across the room, and for a split second, something warm and almost hopeful would flash in his eyes. He wasn't as closed off as he had been before. The cracks in his walls were still there, but they were wider now, and it felt like, just maybe, the pieces of his heart were starting to come back together. It was on the morning of the 5th week after Grace had arrived that everything finally shifted. It wasn't a grand moment, not the kind of thing that would make the world stop and take notice. It was quiet, like everything else in this house. But for Grace and Eli, it felt like the beginning of forever. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Grace was standing by the window, watching as the light poured into the room. She had already started the coffee, the familiar, comforting smell filling the house. Lily was still asleep in her room, and Eli was out at the barn, working to repair the damage the fire had caused. Grace couldn't help but smile as she watched him, his strong hands working the wood with quiet precision. It was then that she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Eli had come inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, but his steps were softer than usual. Grace turned, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw him standing in the doorway. Eli was looking at her differently now, his eyes soft, like he was seeing her for the first time. He didn't say anything right away, but there was a kind of tension in the air, a feeling that something important was about to happen. "Grace," he finally said, his voice low and steady. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't speak. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "You've brought light back into this house," he continued, taking a step closer to her. "I didn't think I could smile again, but you've made it possible. And Lily, she's not so afraid anymore. She's starting to trust again." Grace's heart swelled in her chest. She hadn't expected these words, but somehow, they felt like the most important thing she'd ever heard. "You've been a blessing to us," Eli said, his voice growing softer. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it. More than you'll ever know." He reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was gentle, like a promise. Grace could feel the warmth of his hand, the strength in his fingers, but there was something more in the way he held her gaze. Something deeper. "I'm not the man I used to be," Eli said quietly. "I'm not the man you came here to marry. But I'm a man who's learning. I'm learning to live again, and I want you to be a part of that." Grace's heart was racing now. She had come here to be kind, to help, but never had she imagined that she would find him. The man who had been broken, but was beginning to heal. The man who, despite all his scars, was starting to believe in the possibility of love again. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her hand tightened around his, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. They both knew the truth. They had both been searching for something, and they had found it in each other. "I'm not asking you to forget the past," Eli continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But I'm asking you to share the future with me. I don't have much, but I have this land, and I have my heart. And I want to give it all to you. To both of you." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she looked at him. She had come here to be his wife, to offer him something simple, but she had never imagined that this simple life would be full of so much love. She had come to this house to help, and in return, she had found a family. She had found home. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay with you, Eli. I'll stay with you and Lily forever." In that moment, everything changed. The house that had once been filled with sorrow now echoed with the sounds of hope. The shadows of the past were fading, and in their place, there was light. There was love. There was the promise of tomorrow. Eli took a step closer to her, his hand still holding hers. He didn't need to say anything else. The words were unnecessary now. He leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers, and for the first time since Grace had arrived, she felt at peace. And then, without a word, they kissed. It wasn't a grand kiss, not one that would make the world stop. It was quiet, gentle, full of promises. It was a kiss between two people who had found each other in the middle of their brokenness. It was the beginning of forever. If you've enjoyed the story of Grace and Eli, be sure to like and subscribe for more heartfelt tales of love, healing, and second chances. Don't miss out on the next chapter of their journey. There's always more to discover in the world of unforgettable romances. Thank you for reading, and we hope to see you again soon.